I think I talked about every company needing to be product-led, at least in the dimension of retention. They need to start paying very strong attention to the user instead of just catering for the buyer. Product-led, PLG native type companies, built into their DNA is serving the user. It's right. How can we identify the problems that users have? How can we elegantly solve them in ways that they love, that they want to use the product to solve those problems, that they want to evangelize the product? That's kind of at its heart, PLG.
Hi, and welcome to the June podcast. I'm your host, Enzo, co-founder at June. In this show, I'm talking to the most inspiring product and growth leaders out there who will share their tips on how to launch and grow your SaaS. No fuss, no BS. I hope you enjoyed the show.
Welcome to the June podcast, where we are going to dive into the world of B2B SaaS growth and product-led growth. I'm your host, Enzo, and I'm thrilled to have Ben Williams joining us today.
Hey, folks.
For those that don't know you, I'm going to do a short introduction. So you have over 20 years of experience as an operator. You've been advising founders and heads of product or growth at B2B SaaS companies, helping them achieve sustainable growth through the power of PLG. You have expertise that lies in implementing PLG strategies across what you call key areas like acquisition, retention, and monetization. You are also a prolific writer, sharing your insight on this topic through your Substack, the Product-Led Geek, which is how I discovered you. And you also featured a featured guest at Reforge and contributing to the development of the upcoming PLG program they're doing, correct?
Yep, that's right, yeah.
Before becoming an advisor, you accomplished quite a few cool things, cool stuff. You were the former VP of product at Snyk, a leading cybersecurity company specialized in cloud computing, where you own all things PLG. You told me you joined a company where there were approximately 300 employees and left to a whopping 1.5K people by the end of 2022.
Yeah, it was growing pretty fast at that time.
So whether you're a startup founder or simply looking to level up your growth strategy, you're in for a threat. Get ready to soak up some invaluable wisdom from our guest, Ben, as we explore together the world of B2B SaaS growth in PLG in this episode. The first question I wanted to ask you is, how did Snyk contribute to your understanding of the tech world today?
I think my time at Snyk was, in retrospect, a really great experience for me. You know, I'm someone who's personally happiest when I'm learning. And at Snyk, you know, there were lots of opportunities for that. I think I grew as a product and growth leader in my time there. And I had the opportunity to learn from some pretty amazing people, you know, not least of which, you know, one of the co-founders, Guy Pajani. And he's just a, you know, brilliant first principles thinker. Has an amazing ability to kind of paint really vivid pictures of the potential future and then rally people around that vision. I've worked at a lot of fast growing companies now, but none that were growing, you know, anywhere near the pace that Snyk did. And that taught me a lot too, you know, mainly about alignment, you know, everything from getting people across the company on the same page about what PLG even is and what it meant to Snyk, to building shared understandings about the growth model, building consensus around changes to pricing and packaging, keeping people up to date with what we were doing in growth, the current strategic focus, what experiments we had plans, the results of those, and all that stuff. Because the company was growing so quickly, you know, it was 50 to 70 people each and every month were coming in. It was a real constant challenge that required basically continuous evangelism. So lots of opportunities for learning, lots of opportunities for personal and professional growth.
50, 70 people a month is very impressive. I actually even wonder, so that's 10 to 20 people a week. I actually even wonder how you make this work.
Challenging was one, but maintaining like solid hiring practices. I think one of the difficult things that I think Snyk did well overall. Definitely, you're not going to get everything perfect when you're growing at that scale. But one of the things they did well was kind of maintain cultural integrity through that process. You
touched on two things that I want to follow up on already. First was PLG. Did you call PLG at Snyk, or was it something else and then you kind of like formalize that later on in your career?
Yeah, we did call it PLG. I'm not sure in the very early, I think the very early days of Snyk's growth, like in inception, was before the PLG term had come to light. So what Snyk was doing there in terms of bottom up adoption, it was PLG at heart, but probably no one called it. And obviously that was before my time. But by the time I joined, I was very specifically recruited to help with PLG efforts.
Snyk might have been one of the earliest PLG company out there with Atlassian and the likes, right?
Yeah, possibly. I mean, it's still a few years later than Atlassian, but I mean, definitely if you look at the security domain, then definitely one of the earliest and one of the very few overall. So.
You also mentioned first principles and how your former founder or the founder of Snyk had an influence on you. With that, could you walk us through some epiphany moment, maybe, where you realized the importance of thinking first principles? And is there, any, I don't know, examples you could share with us of first principle thinking that you applied that turned out to work really well?
I can't think of any specific examples there, but every conversation with Guy, he would kind of have this incredible ability to unpack the context and really get to the underlying, again, first principles of the subject, whether we were talking about market dynamics, the shifts in market dynamics, how he thought about the developer market and the different types of developers and what that meant from a product capability perspective. He would always dig in deep and then kind of rebuild things back up to come to some conclusion. And that was a kind of a thought process that always just resonated so deeply with me, and it made it very easy to get behind those kinds of things because the way they'd been unpacked just made so much sense.
You talked also about the alignment and the importance of the alignment when you scale very fast. I kind of hear that you also use some of these principles to align with you and the rest of the team as the spaceship was, going very fast. Is this correct?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. There was a huge education piece in it and a re-education piece. If you think when you're growing that fast, literally there is a significant percentage of the company each month that hasn't heard all of the messaging and evangelism and education around, the core tenets of product-led growth, what that specifically meant in the Snyk context, because, PLG is a broad spectrum of things. And those folks hadn't heard it. And actually the folks who had heard it, because the market was changing so quickly, because the product was changing so quickly, the messaging had to be repeated. There's this phrase I got, like, repetition never spoiled the prayer. And that was a mantra I really needed to live by at Snyk because of the need for that constant evangelism.
One question I'd love to ask you, since you're kind of a growth person, you're a product person with a lot of growth expertise. So let me rephrase that question. Do you feel growth people, or when you work on growth, do you feel it's also about solving people's problems the same way we try to solve problems in product? Or do you think it's a bit, it's slightly different?
I think it depends at what stage you are. When you're at the stage where you have separate product and growth teams, then you can take on a more specialized remit. And it's not quite so vanilla, black and white, but product teams can kind of generally be focusing on creating the value within the platform that is addressing every user persona's core needs, addressing the things that they need to get their jobs done. You have the luxury then, if you have a separate growth team, for that growth team to be focused on not building out that value, but finding ways to bring new users of the right fit to that value. And once they're here in the product, optimizing the connection of those new users to that value.
I love it. Do you have an example maybe you can share to be a bit less abstract?
So again, I'll use Snyk as the example. So whole separate product, core product capability, core product function that was working on the platform. And there's a large and growing function. So different folks working on cloud security, on container security, on infrastructure as code, as open source security, and so on. They're building the core platform. They're building all the capabilities on top of that are serving individual users in the context of their teams, in the context of their companies, and building the capabilities around that. So that's the stuff that solves the user pain, solves the user problems. In growth, we weren't building out new features, but what we were doing was finding the acquisition channels that would scale effectively and bring new users and their teams into the product. And we were focusing on things like onboarding and activating those users such that as many of them could be successful in the product in a self-serve manner, could build habits around using the product, and ultimately become candidates for monetization down the line.
There is this very, very famous hack that you mentioned a few times on other podcasts that I heard with Snyk, right? Which is the badge being added to the pull request, right? Which then in return would give more visibility. Was this one adding value in the end? Potentially it was, right?
Oh, so actually there were badges. That was actually something separate. The thing that I've written about a lot and spoken about on podcasts was actually something that was part of the core product value, but it doubled as a growth thing. And in fact, it originated at a time before there was a growth function, right? So it was when it was just product, and product had some growth responsibility as well. And it was basically the ability that, once you've connected your source code repos to Snyk, Snyk would scan them. And because it could automatically fix some of the vulnerabilities it found, and the way it would fix that was effectively by upgrading dependencies. And the way to upgrade dependencies was to submit a pull request against the repo. Snyk would just write that pull request automatically and submit it. And then, of course, that's a Snyk branded pull request. It's got all the details of what the change is, links back into Snyk to see why this change was made, details of the vulnerability, and so on. And of course, it's a simple merge to put that into your code base and address that vulnerability. But of course, people who hadn't been aware of Snyk, who were working in that repo, would see those, learn about Snyk, and come into the product. So just an example of a company-generated content loop that Snyk was. They got a bunch of those. They were very good at them. But yeah, that's an example of a growth initiative that I think originated actually from the early days of the product. And I don't really know. I should chat to Guy about this, but kind of in those early days when that was initiated, I'm not sure how much of a growth context that had in mind versus just this is an amazing way to help users, because that was the first of a kind integration. It was the first time security had been integrated into the development workflow in such a tight way, and so it's kind of transformational from that perspective, but also had the benefit of growth as well.
I mean, basically what you just said is that it started as a product initiative, a product feature, and then turned into one of these viral loops, right? It's very interesting to see that sometime, the viral loop just comes from a product feature that then is kind of amplified a little bit.
I think often with early stage companies who are, they're consciously, founders will have or should have really been thinking about how the company grows. They won't be optimizing for it pre-product market fit, but when they get to product market fit, they should already have a good idea of how things how the product will grow. And, having that in mind enables kind of experimentation around those kind of things within the core product team. I think where it becomes different is when you start to take on more and more customers. You want to expand into things like enterprise scenarios. You need to invest more effort in like governance features and things like that. And some of the growth optimization work, both smaller optimizations and bigger bets, that becomes, a whole stream of work that should happen, or that would benefit from being ring fenced and not subverted to the needs of the next big paying customer that comes along and says, it would be great if you could help us with this sort of thing. And that's when having that separate growth function, people who are thinking about that day in, day out, starts to make sense, right?
To connect that a little bit with the advising you've been doing with startups,
Mm-hmm.
So you say the founders should have some ideas, right? So let's say you jump on a call, you meet one of the founders, hopefully they have an idea of how they want to grow. And maybe one of these ideas is virality, right? So maybe they sense that because of the nature of their product or their market or their strategy, there might be a virality channel. When should it start testing out these loops or trying to layer on top of their product some kind of virality versus, just keep building the product? Especially, I'm curious to hear your answer for early stage startups versus a bit, later stage startups. How do you advise them on that?
It's so dependent on the specific product. For viral loops to be effective, and that Snyk loop I gave, I don't think that's an example of a viral loop. It might seem like a viral loop, but it's really a content loop, because it's Snyk generating content. It's not your usual content that's distributed through GitHub. It's through Google. It's distributed through GitHub instead, but it's someone finding the content, engaging with it, and coming into the product. Viral loops are, I think, the main couple of types of viral loops are incentivized viral loops, like referral schemes and so on, and viral loops through invitations, plus also kind of word of mouth. I think, that whether it's the right time or not, you've got to see the opportunity for the product you have to be solving a problem for a significant larger portion of the user base, and enough passion within the user base for them to be able to share that, to want to share that. And for them to want to share it, there's typically a few things, whether it's within the company, right? In that case, kind of their motivation for doing so is because the product becomes more valuable when more people within the company are using it. If it's outside of the company, then you've got to find other ways to incentivize type referrals and so on. And then you've got to kind of be thinking about the incentive on both the referrer side and the referred side. What's the incentive to send a referral? What's the incentive to accept a referral? So you want to look at that, kind of all those different things to understand, what's the right flavor of virality, and is this something that can feasibly work for us at our point? But ultimately, you've got to have a product that is, extremely valuable and sticky in itself, right? Because and when I say sticky, I mean strong inherent retention characteristics. Because unless you have those, viral loops will quickly fade out. You want every user to be possibly generating multiple further instances of that loop. And for it to compound effectively, you want all of those new users to be doing the same, which means, the product needs to retain well.
I love how you come from the product world, and really we can tell that it's all about the value that you get, that you derivate, and just trying to layer, hacks for the sake of it won't work or won't survive.
No, exactly.
Is there some metas or frameworks that you're using to prioritize the growth experiments or the initiatives for the B2B startups you advise?
Yes, but honestly, I really like to keep it simple. I nine times out of 10, a simple ICE scoring system for growth experiments, growth initiatives, that's going to work well enough. I think you have to accept the fact that there is no scoring rubric that's ever been created that is perfect. And the goal should be to learn as much as you can. So spending time with, overly complex scoring mechanisms, it's always felt kind of counterproductive to me. I think there are lots of things that are worth geeking out over, but I don't think that should be one of them. You've got to apply a filter to all the ideas, regardless of how you score them, to make sure that they align with your current objectives and the strategy. And that should, really be all that you need. Yeah, maybe one more thing. Over a period of time, it's probably useful to think about having a portfolio of bets as well. Just as the same way you think about having a portfolio of investments, some quicker wins with potential lower impact, other bigger bets that could generate big returns. But yeah, keeping it simple, focusing on learning, that's what I'm all about.
Great one. Is there any kind of common categories, though, to categorize the bets that you're usually using?
If you use the ICE scoring framework, for example, then impact is the I there. That's a key part of it. Then you've got confidence and effort, and if you combine confidence and effort, you can basically come up with a risk score, and then you can plot impact against risk. And so there's going to be some that just fall into the quadrant that are, just no-brainers. You've got to do that. High impact, low risk. It's going to be some that are high input, high impact, higher risk. Yes, you want to kind of do that. The ones you don't want to do, of course, are potentially low impact and high risk. So
we had the first episode of the podcast with Jana Basto. She created you know her. So for those who don't know her, she created Product-Led and was part of the founding team of Mind the Product. She also uses a lot of frameworks for product, but she felt that ICE was a bit all over, because as soon as you multiply two scores together, they would get amplified and they can get out of control. And she felt that even though there aren't much better frameworks, she felt definitely a limitation of using this one. Did you feel the same?
Yeah, I generally agree with that. I don't advocate for using that in kind of core product. In growth, I do, but I also don't multiply either. So I've got a growth database that I use with many of my advising clients, and I've used over the years with companies I've been at. And the ICE calculations are actually simple additions. So the E is ease instead of effort. So a higher ease score is a better score. So I plus C plus E.
Awesome! Wow, that's a great idea, actually. Another question I wanted to ask you is, since you're doing advising right now, I always struggle to understand how an advisor like you treats customer feedback, and what is the role that they play in your advisory work. Is it nice to have? Is it a luxury? Can you have conversation with your customers of your customers? Do you absolutely need them? Maybe it depends on the kind of work you have to do. How do you leverage them in your offering?
Yeah, so I think the question really then is more about what role customer feedback plays in product development and company building, right? And the answer is, of course, that it's critical. You have to be always listening to your users and customers. You need to be close to them from day one. There are so many rich signals that are in those customer conversations and feedback that, you ignore them at your peril, basically. You can try and intuit your way to building a great product, but honestly, it's probably not going to work out too well for you. What problems are you solving? For who? How can you help solve those problems? Of course, there's an art to not just, collecting feedback, but also how you interpret and act on it. You'll rarely go off and just blindly build things the way that customers ask for. But they're still such important signals. And, when companies scale, they can pivot too much to relying on quant data and start to pay less attention to the qual side. And I think that's, a real problem. Teams should be using qual to better explain quantitative observations. And qual should also be generating hypotheses that they validate in quant. So I think to your original question, when getting to know companies through my advisory engagements, personally, I want to, I'm hungry to dig into all forms of user and customer data, whether it's feedback, interviews, session replays, behavioral analytics, and so on. To me, it's all important as I build, a deeper understanding of the business.
What's usually the outcome of that? Do you usually have surprises for the founding teams? Do you teach them stuff, or is it more like you're fine tuning and finding out details that actually can be quite important? Maybe.
Again, it depends. I've worked with companies that don't even track a kind of product-led funnel, and so really have big blind spots in the efficiency of their product at multiple stages. To others that have really mature understanding of that stuff, but perhaps are missing some things in monetization opportunities and so on. So it completely varies, but there's almost always some things that I'll see there that, amongst all that data, that help me identify potential opportunities within the business. And that's why these companies engage with advisors, right? It's to help them know the things that they just don't know today.
Yeah, that's very true. That's very true. I'd like to go back to your experience with PLG now. Thanks so much for working us through your relationship with your customers. So you mentioned that PLG was a term at Snyk, and that like you had luxury to do some growth. I wonder how Snyk landed with PLG. Was it an intentional strategy from the get-go? For instance, since you were recruited, did it come up later on? Was it formalized later on? Maybe also, what did it teach you about PLG?
Yeah. So I only joined Snyk at the beginning of 2021, but the strategy from the early origins of the company, in 2015, I think that was when Guy founded it, long before my time there. It's always been product-led, even if it wasn't called product-led. But there's some, I think, important nuance there. So the thing is, in the security domain, like security tooling, it's always been sold top down. CISO buyers, other AppSec leaders. And, in the incumbent tooling, you'd see that play out, right? You'd have basically low end user adoption, poor retention. And in our space, what that meant was kind of low developer adoption. But the DevOps and the whole shift left movement, I think, provided a real opportunity to approach application security very differently from the way that the incumbents were doing things. So Snyk has had PLG in its DNA from the moment the company was founded. Again, even if it wasn't called PLG, it's kind of just baked into the reason the company exists. It had a free plan from day one, and bottom-up adoption was just a cornerstone of how the product and the company grew. I think one thing it really reinforced for me, my time there, is just how developer tooling is such a great fit for that go-to-market motion. There are many reasons for that, but it's pretty unique. It's like, it's kind of, if I saw the perfect fit for PLG, basically I'd see a bunch of developers there.
I saw in one of your blog articles that you said that, and it was quite surprising to me, that your feeling is that over time, any company that doesn't embrace at least partially PLG takes the risk to be disrupted, right? So you said developer toolings is a great starting point. What other environments or industry are great, applications, and what industries are not? In which industries would you not recommend to do PLG, at least not in 2023?
There is a broad spectrum of what PLG means, and maybe we can talk about that in a moment as well. But what I would say, and going back to the quote you referenced there, I think I talked about every company needing to be product-led, at least in the dimension of retention. And what I mean by that is that they need to start paying very strong attention to the user instead of just catering for the buyer. So product-led, PLG native type companies, built into their DNA is serving the user. It's right. How can we identify the problems that users have? How can we elegantly solve them in ways that they want to, that they love, that they want to use the product to solve those problems, that they want to evangelize the product? That's kind of at its heart, PLG. But sales-led companies, and it's not all, some of them have great products that have great user experiences, but there are certain products, certain very, very big companies built around those products that simply have terrible experiences for the end user, but they tick all the right boxes for the buyer from an organization standpoint. Now, it's my strong belief that what will happen is that eventually other companies will come along that tick all those boxes, but also deliver an amazing user experience. And it's then just a matter of time before those companies effectively eat the lunch of the incumbents.
Matter of time and execution, as always. You touch on the different kind of PLG. Can you work us through?
It's definitely nuanced, right? You have Elena's 3x3 model of go-to-market motions across the growth levers of acquisition, retention, and monetization. So you can be product-led, marketing-led, or sales-led across each lever. But you also have the dimension of time and how you're going to sequence different motions in each of those levers. I think of it kind of like a Rubik's Cube, and you have to figure out the right way to solve it for your company. Often, with product-led motions, for example, you need to kickstart those product-led loops with marketing-led efforts, right? Lenny's got his race car framework that talks about those kind of those boosts that you can apply. So that's the way I tend to think about it. But there's huge variances in what your approach to product-led growth should be, depending on the context of your company, like where you're starting from. Are you starting from kind of bottom up type business serving users? Are you starting as a historically sales-led business? A whole different spectrum of the different ways in which you can be product-led.
So you touched a little bit on product-led sales. There is one question that always intrigued me. It's very hard to have product-led sales when you're a startup, because product-led sales means you have a lot of inbound and you're able to qualify these inbounds from the product to then sell them, which means that you usually have a salesperson or even sometimes a sales team. But when you're getting started and you're product-led, it's very unlikely that you have multiple sales motion. So I always wonder how can a startup be product-led with product-led sales? Is it me like not getting it at all, or is product-led sales kind of like a motion that only works when you're later stage?
It's a great question. So are you talking about the starting point being kind of PLG native, pure play PLG companies and layering on PLS?
Yeah, that's my feeling.
Yeah.
My feeling is that PLS means you were PLG before, right? Otherwise you wouldn't use the word PL. But maybe I'm getting that wrong.
Make me understand. Sorry, you're suggesting that it's easy to go to product-led sales if you were PLG before, but not if you were sales-led?
Yes, that way.
That way. Okay.
My understanding is to do product-led sales, you need to have leads that comes from the product, meaning that you had to be PLG before.
Well, yes, you need leads from the product, but that doesn't mean it's not something that can be implemented by historically sales-led companies, right? Historically sales-led companies can have huge volumes of usage from paying customers, right? So, I mean, I guess this could be a whole podcast in itself, but I'll try and give a reasonable summary. So sales-led companies are probably serving higher complexity use cases. They've probably, to your point, not had any way for users and teams to experience value before a paywall. So the first thing you've got to assess is kind of finding out what's the right flavor of of PLG for our company, right? So you could, for example, leverage product usage data to farm your existing customer base for expansion opportunities, and to, on the inverse side of that, detect and intervene in churn risk accounts. If you go that route, then you're going to need a product with reasonably strong retention characteristics. And you'll probably be working on monetization awareness within the product to help make users and teams aware of the different ways your product can solve additional use cases. So yes, it's absolutely possible to do that without product-led acquisition. But if you want to build a product-led acquisition motion and then start to use product-led sales to drive new business, then you're going to need to start to provide some value before a paywall, which is the new thing for a product-led, for a sales-led company. And of course, that can come in, many shapes and sizes too, not all mutually exclusive. So I think at the simplest end, you can have an interactive demo on your site, like those made with Walnut or Novatic, or you might build a sandbox environment that visitors can try. You might offer a free time limited or usage limited trial, or you might decide that, going all in with a freemium strategy is the right thing, or maybe combine the free plan and a trial with a reverse trial. But maybe your existing core product isn't a perfect fit for some of those motions, right? Maybe there's just too much complexity in the use cases that you're serving, or in your product itself in its current state. Maybe that's too complex, which you might be able to do something about, or it might be too big a lift. But in that case, it just might not be feasible to get to a place where users could self-serve activate and build habits around the product. So maybe then you could consider building something that's adjacent that might act as a beachhead for a product-led land, and later expand into your core offering. And you could implement, we talked about kind of usage there. We didn't talk about monetization. Another flavor, got to decide, are you going to have self-serve monetization with credit card checkout flows and so on? If there's a saleable offering that makes sense for individuals or teams at the lower end of the market, that might be something that's worth investigating. So there's so many different paths that you could take, so many variables, the market, who your users are, where they're, whether they're there out there just trying to find solutions to problems they have, the characteristics of your existing product, your company culture, and so on. So what's right for one company won't be right for the next. There's no one size fits all.
I think you answered my question. And I think, I think now I understand that, I understand that where this whole thing is coming from. And I kind of understand also what the product-led sales solutions, who they are targeting, sorry.
Yeah,
and I think it resonates better than before.
The reasons you do that as a sales company are go-to-market efficiency. I mean, ultimately, if you've got better qualified leads, that once they are ready to be engaged with, and it might take a while, it might take many months for them to be in a state where they've got qualified usage that means it's the right time to engage. But where you've got those accounts that are basically fueling your sales pipeline, and to much higher quality leads and typically shorter sales cycle, because a lot of that pre-qualification of value has already been done, then your sales motions inherently become more efficient.
Yeah, and it kind of doesn't matter.
So I was going to say, if that's on the new business side as well. If you look at the existing business side of things, then it becomes easier to identify and farm for expansion opportunities. You get better at churn prevention. So net dollar retention is inherently, with those two things going up in that direction, more efficiency, right?
100%. And kind of what I get from that is that it doesn't really matter where the customers come from, if they self-serve with a credit card or if they were onboarded by your sales, they are still inside the product and can trigger usage threshold that can then turn into upsell, cross-sell, or whatever dynamics.
Yeah.
I think that makes a lot of sense. One thing I noticed reading your blog is the amount of love and care you put into data metrics in PLG. You have I found probably like a dozen articles about metrics and how to define them and how to measure them. I'd love to get a quick summary from you, if you don't mind. So I'd love to know how you approach measuring and quantifying the success of growth initiatives within B2B startups. What metrics do you consider the most important?
I think the answer to this is really dependent on things like the growth strategy and the go-to-market strategy. So quantified success, I think, would look very different for traditionally top-down sales-led company who is looking to introduce aspects of product-led sales, for example, to help better farm the existing customer base. Their success metrics, that looks different than it would for a PLG native pure self-serve product. If you look at like that latter case, that PLG native pure self-serve product, even then some key metrics are going to look different. For example, if your acquisition channels bias towards content, or if they bias towards virality, then there's going to be different metrics that you really care about tracking on a regular basis. But regardless, I think the most important thing is that the initiatives and focus become guided by strategy, and that any KPIs you're optimizing, that they are predictive of strategic success. So the way I think about that is, often starting with just building simple KPI trees that roll up to a North Star. That can just be something that's super useful.
Very, very interesting. What could be in PLG, what could be a North Star and branches of that tree? Just to give an example, maybe.
So for PLG companies, I'm a big fan of engagement-based North Star metrics. Not just your default like daily active users, weekly active users. I think those are often picked too arbitrarily. I think for an engagement-based metric, it should be about the core action. So the core action, like for Snyk, was teams fixing. That was the value, right? It wasn't the fact that we could find vulnerabilities or show them. It was whether the team was fixing those vulnerabilities. So fixing was the core action. We cared about security being a team sport. So it wasn't users, it was teams. Orgs was the Snyk term for a team. So fixing orgs, and then the natural usage frequency of the product, which really should reflect the natural problem frequency, the natural use case frequency there. We expected teams should be paying down their security debt on a weekly basis. So weekly was that natural frequency. So that North Star became weekly fixing orgs. And then from there, of course, you can start to kind of derive initiatives, not just in the growth and product teams, but across multiple teams around the company.
I love it. It's a great one, because if you look at the user level, you may have a bias, right? How do you avoid the bias with the engagement? Because one thing I heard many times is you may have few companies using your thing a lot. If you just check the number of companies, then you avoid the bias. Is it correct?
What do you mean by bias? Help me understand there.
If few companies fixes a lot things, you're gonna have a high count, even though there are a few companies. But since you only count the number of companies or orgs, you don't have any bias created by the very intense usage, right? It's flattened out.
Yeah, exactly. And even then if you drill deeper into our engagement states that we defined, so it wasn't volume based. Engagement states was based on frequency of fixing. So we actually defined 3 core buckets or 3 buckets of engagement state plus the dormant state. And we define those through a data science activity. But as the number of unique days in the last 30 that a team had been fixing. So if they had fixed 0 unique days in the last 30 days, they were dormant. If they had fixed between 1 and 3 unique days, regardless of how many fixes, but on those unique days, between 1 and 3 days, they were in the casual bucket. between 4 and 7 unique days, they were in the core bucket, and 8+ unique days in the last 30 fixing, then that was the progressive bucket. And core was called core, not because most teams were in there, but because, again, that was the natural usage frequency. If they were fixing between 4 and 7 unique days in the last 30, that roughly equated to a weekly usage period. But the boundaries of those buckets were actually at key inflection points, whereby we knew that if someone was in that bucket and they moved from this bucket to the next, that would have a significant change in their likelihood to be retained 12 months later and still fixing vulnerabilities with Snyk 12 months later. So you'd see in the dormant bucket, it was only like 3 or 4% or something of teams in that bucket would still be fixing 12 months later, compared to if you're in that progressive bucket, 80%, right? And something's in the middle in the other two.
So was the weekly fixing organization kind of the North Star, and this bucket kind of the branches beneath that, and then you were trying to move people from one bucket to another? Was it the kind of the tree?
It was just as I was leaving Snyk that we kind of the few months before I left, that we were kind of pulling all of this stuff together and operationalizing it. But I believe now that, some of those engagement states have been operationalized to a deeper level. They're being used, in product-led sales and all sorts. So it's pretty exciting.
What other metrics so you mentioned one that you're a very big fan of. What other metrics do you think early stage PLG companies should be tracking on average?
Probably another it depends situation, right? I mean, if you do what Snyk did and work your way to thousands of free users before you introduce any monetization, then you're going to be more focused on those product metrics than anything else, right, in your early days. So usage-based retention will be important, working on activation and engagement to improve retention. Resurrecting churned or dormant users is another input to improving retention, but it's not something I actually recommend teams focus on unless activation and engagement are already well optimized, and that's pretty unlikely with early stage companies. You're likely tracking the cost and efficiency of user acquisition channels to try and optimize the mix as you grow. But early stage, of course, you've also got to be thinking about your monetization model and what that will look like. You've probably got a bunch of hypotheses that you want to validate. So if you're taking that bottom up approach, and you're building in public with a free to use product, you're engaging in continuous discovery, then I think monetization opportunities will eventually and inevitably start to bubble to the surface. It might be signals like a number of folks commenting how they can't believe that XYZ is free, or telling you that they'd pay you if you could only do this one thing, or that implementing feature A would enable them to use your product across their department, or implementing feature B would mean they could drop the use of this other tool that they're currently paying for. So pre-revenue, I think tracking those commercial intent signals, as well as core product metrics, I think it's important. If you're already monetizing, maybe still early stage, but you're already monetizing, then obviously, a bunch of other metrics start to become important. Tracking paid conversion rates, whether that's self-serve or with sales, tracking things like CAC payback period, really important to optimize your acquisition channels and try to get to a position where growth is being funded by customers instead of investment dollars. Runway, your runway. With shorter runways, you're going to start to be paying a little bit more attention to gross margin, right? Net dollar retention is always a staple metric. And for PLG companies, I've written about this one a lot, actually. I love product influenced revenue, which is the revenue that comes from originates where any meaningful activity was experienced in the product before there was any sales outreach. So that's a really nice one for tracking kind of product-led efficiency as your company scales.
That's a great one. So these are a lot of different things. If you could have, if there was a Ben Williams template in June, would you separate these metrics into multiple views? Would you try to put everything in the same? What do you advise your startups, the startups you advise?
I'd probably separate out some of the financial ones from the product side. On the product side, for sure, I'd have retention charts, I'd have activation charts, like in aggregate, as well as kind of more funnel-based views that are a little more actionable. I'd have charts that show engagement state mix and the change in engagement states from period to period. You want to know how many accounts are moving from each state to other states, because your efforts really are going to be directed at doing that movement upwards and preventing downwards movement as well. I'd have charts covering new user growth. I'd have charts for active users, but instead of just headline like DAO, WOW, MAU metrics, I'd have detailed user growth accounting, because XAU style active metrics, they're basically a function of two things, right? One, the product's ability to retain, and two, the input of new users. So you need user growth accounting because new users will basically mask poor retention if you don't have that growth accounting. So I definitely have a growth accounting chart in there. But as we kind of touched on earlier in B2B, I'd also want all of this at the account level, not the user level, or not just the user level. So that'd be something that I'd want to be configurable per chart.
So you would keep both views, one for user level and one for account level, and they would tell you different things, basically?
Yeah.
Right. Hope we can make this template happen.
Let's do it.
Thank you. We touched a little bit on the qualitative aspect of things, but when we think about some of the main metrics you just gave, what are the metrics that you would really be careful to interpret without the qualitative insight that goes with them? What is one? What would you want? You talk about pricing. Maybe pricing is the most important one. Maybe another one.
Metrics they're just not very good at telling you why, right? They'll tell you a snapshot of what something was at a point in time. You can show trends about how things are changing. But if you want to figure out like why something's going in a particular direction, why are customers churning at a higher rate than they were last month, right? You can dig into some data, you can come up with hypothesis. But unless you're out there kind of getting qualitative research, you're only working with half the picture. So you asked me to pick one. I would say picking one is not great advice, and take it more holistically and integrate qual into your overall arsenal. Again,
it depends. Yeah. Such a great conclusion. Thank you, Ben, for coming. It was a pleasure to have you on the episode.
Yeah, it was really fun, Enzo. I love doing this. So thanks for having me.
I'll make sure to add all the references you mentioned. You mentioned Elena, Lenny. I'm sure a lot of people have questions about who these people might be. So I'll link to them. To find you out, where should people head after this podcast?
Yeah, sure. So place where I am kind of most regularly is on LinkedIn. So I love connecting with people and having discussions over there. So please do come and hit me up there. But also, you talked about my newsletter. Yeah, I love writing. I'd love for folks to come and check out what I'm doing there. So that's easy to find. It's just at plg.news.
And you have amazing content. And that's really what I love about your newsletter. You can really tell the effort that you're putting to write unique stuff. It's very different. Like you have really good nuggets there.
I appreciate it so much. Thanks, Enzo.
Thank you for listening to the June podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a 5-star rating and subscribe. This episode is powered by June. For a better way to do product analytics, visit june.so.